And with no further ado, I'm going to invite the panel, one by one, to come up and join me. On behalf of the Austrian presidency, Günter Liebel, please come and take a seat. Thank you, Günter. Günter started off, interestingly, as a landscape architect, then went into the Austrian Environment Agency, and is now with the Ministry of Sustainability and Tourism, and is Director General for Environment and Water Management. So thank you very much, Günter, for making it here from Vienna. Then we have Veronica Manfredi, a lawyer by training, worked with DG Justice on Consumer, now DG Environment, and is the Director for Quality of Life. Thank you, Veronica. Benedek Jávor, a Green MEP, also was a founding member of Protect the Earth, an environment group in Hungary. He's vice chair of a parliamentary committee, as many of you may know, on environment and health and food safety. I would just like to say that Benedek has to leave us at 11:30. So it's not that he's walking out in disgust, it is because it's pre-arranged. Yeah? Celine Charveriat. Celine has had a long career with Oxfam International. She's on the board of the Climate Action Network, and now she's executive director of a think tank, IEEP. And last but not least, many of you will know him, Patrick ten Brink, who is Director of Policy at the European Environmental Bureau. Previously, he worked with Celine at IEEP, and many of these questions, such as biodiversity loss and circular economy, are his strengths. So thank you very much for joining me. So we're going to, first of all, ask everybody for a success in EU environmental policy and why. Then we're going to look at failures, then we're going to look at priorities. So Günter's going to start, and Günter doesn't want to play by the rules because he told me, first of all, that he wanted to tell us a story. And as I'm a former journalist, I thought, let him tell a story, but then he has to get on to the success. Okay, so that's the rules we're playing by. Günter.
Yes, good.
It should come on automatically.
Hello? Hello? If it's not working, hello, anybody?
Hello, thanks. First of all, I want to thank EEB for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Monday morning in Brussels is always a pleasure. If you have a look on the screen, it says all change at the EU. And the story I want to tell you in a few minutes is, I'm coming from Austria, from Vienna, where we have a lot of music. And I want to compare a little bit the European Union and how it works, especially in the field and environment, and compare it with making music. What do you need? You need a composer. Who is the composer in Europe? It's the Commission. What changed during the last years? The composer changed the rules of composing. If you compare how it was composed 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, then there had been quite a lot of different composers. It had been the commissioners. The last composer changed a little bit the rules. He sent out letters to his co-composers where he gave strict rules how they should compose their arias. So composer is important, but it's also important how he is composing. What also changed? What do you need for music too? You need an orchestra. An orchestra normally has violins and flutes, and you have braces and you have harps. Sometimes you have a little bit a big drum. The orchestra, they are the member states. Did they change? I think the composing of the orchestra changed a little bit. Sometimes we get the feeling that we have more big drums there. We lost the flutes, we lost the harps. The conductor, that's sometimes the presidency, but the conductor is only as strong as the orchestra is. And then you need the audience. Who is the audience? The audience is the European Parliament. They also play quite a big role, because normally they are listening, they are clapping, sometimes they are booing, because they are not really fine with the composing and with playing the music. And I also think that a little bit of the audience changed during the last years. And if you compare these little story playing music in Europe and how it changed, especially in the field of environment policy, I think we recognized that during the last years there was a change. There was a big change in European environmental policy, because the composer, the orchestra, and the audience changed. I don't say that it is going in the wrong direction, but we should recognize that we have different players, and we will have different players, different composers, different members of the orchestra, and different audience also in a few months. And therefore we should think who can really work in a better way for the environment. Is it only the composer? Or is it to the orchestra? Or is it to the audience? Because if they don't pay for the cards, then nobody will go to the concert. And I think all three must work together. That will be the big challenge for the next 5-6 years in Europe. And the EEB as a motor in working with all these three parts should really think how can we work with these three parts of this musician for the next years. So this was the short story.
And it's good because we've got the orchestra, we've got composers, we've got everybody here. So let me ask then, to follow on this analogy of harmony, where has there been harmony in environmental policy? Where has there been one success? And I will ask everybody for some harmonious notes where we're all in agreement. One success, Günter.
For me, the success was that environmental policy is still on the agenda.
Woo! Okay. Yes. Please follow that, Veronica.
Now that Günter, something happened. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Our technician.
Maybe if I touch the bottom.
So good morning, everyone. Now that Mr. Günter Liebel makes me feel like Mozart, and I must say I like to feel like Mozart, because what is fantastic about him is that he was a composer of a music which was extremely complex, but ultimately extremely joyful. We just heard how important emotions are in driving the agendas. Well, I would love to see a commission that is a true Mozart for the years to come. But indeed, inspired by his beautiful and poetic image, I feel that the Commission has had a particularly difficult task over the last 5 years and faces now an extremely difficult task as well, in a context, here I would like to again rejoin Günter Liebel, in a context where I think we have achieved during the Juncker mandate to really show how important it is to continue being on a path for a truly sustainable development. But certainly all the ingredients are there to put environmental policy together with climate change in a synergetic manner much higher on the agenda. Well, we are facing a situation where, as composers, we have to very well understand the expectation and the taste of the audience. An audience which is changing at speed light, at light speed, rhythm and pace. An audience which, if we look at the results of most recent political elections, is either showing a very strong condemnation of existing establishment and go towards certain form of extremism, or actually votes for Green Party, and much more so, in the hope to really invest into a more positive, pragmatic agenda. The audience is changing, the orchestra needs a lot of additional strength and capacity to deliver, because the music must become more complex. We need maybe more instrument, even better skilled musicians, and that, as well as composers, we have to help the conductor and the orchestra people to grow in order to deliver up to the expectation. I believe that there are many successes if we now look backwards in environmental policy. Let me mention one: drinking water. 90% of the member states across Europe have water coming out of the tap which you can drink without any problem. Industrial emissions. We have reduced by over 70% sulfur dioxide emissions across Europe compared to 1990. I still remember a very vivid, my very first Environmental Council with Commissioner Vella, where I heard from the State Secretary of Germany that has been born and was born and grew up in the Ruhr region, how much you can sense and smell the difference in the air quality in the region it comes from. So we have achieved already a lot, but clearly now is the time for putting together the various policy challenges into something that is truly cross-cutting, and this is the most important and difficult task of the composer to start with.
Thank you very much. So drinking water, air quality, Benedek, the audience, where would you say, I know it's difficult for a Green, but where would you say that there has been a success in environmental policy?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here this morning. I'm really happy to share my thoughts with you. To start with that, very honestly, personally, I cannot share this approach to decision making as an orchestra and audience and things like that. First of all, European citizens are completely missing from this picture, and I don't know who they are in this symbolic orchestra. On the other hand, I believe that also the Parliament is not simply an audience, but a co-legislator of the European institutions, which influences highly the decisions made. So it's part of the orchestra, let's say. And I believe that also the audience, if the European citizens are the audience, they should be part of creating the music. And it's not a one-way decision-making process where the composer composes something and the orchestra plays as the conductor says, and finally we listen to that. But, and I know and I see all the shortcomings of democratic accountability and democratic control over the European institution. Still, my dream and my goal is to create a decision-making system in Europe which is much more joint work of European citizens, Commission, Parliament, and Member States, the Council, to make the best possible music.
Is there one policy area?
And regarding the success story, I've chosen a particular issue, and that's the question of energy efficiency. Not because this is such an outbreaking success, but to illustrate that what success means in European context. And perhaps from the outside, from the citizens' perspective, it's not so amusing or entertaining to see the fights between the institutions over percentages and targets and things like that. But finally, I think that in the energy efficiency area, in the last couple of years, we were able to push it in the heart of the discussion over energy policy in the EU, and to turn energy efficiency first principle into a reality in at least in decision making or policy making level, and also in the energy efficiency directive, which was not an easy ride. Those who followed it closely know very well that how many difficulties we had with the file from the very beginning. But at the end, the Parliament was able to force the Commission and the Council to accept something which was absolutely unacceptable when we started the discussions, and to reach a 32.5% target for 2030 in energy efficiency, which was 2.5% higher than the Commission proposal and 5.5% higher than the Council conclusion in 2014. And this is not simply, and I finish here, it's not simply a game with numbers, but it means gigatons and gigatons of CO2 emissions in the next 12 years, which we can save. And I think that this is the real success, and these are the steps, these are the developments which really change the world and which really could help us to achieve what we decided to achieve in Paris a few years ago, and to do something really effective to stop or to at least to control climate change. These are, that's how successes look like in the EU. It's normally, it's a very complicated decision-making process, and it's not something really outbreaking or a revolution, but those small steps, when we are able to raise the ambition, when we are able to make better decisions together, these are really contributing something much better.
Thank you very much, Benedek, and perhaps there's no surprise that that was one of the Juncker Commission's priorities, climate change and energy efficiency. Celine, a success from your point of view in policy terms?
Hi, very good to be here today. I mean, to continue with the musical analogy, if European environmental policy were to be a radio, you know, where the old radios, not the new ones, where you're looking and you hear a lot of noise and cacophony, a lot of silence as well. And then suddenly I heard a somewhat, a beautiful music. It didn't last very long, but I was like, oh, maybe there's more to come. So that music is the ban of single-use plastic items. Obviously, it's not a done deal yet. It's just been voted in the Parliament. But what I think is really good is it's a real contrast with the ridiculous debate, in my view, around the eco-design directive and the toaster gate. I mean, this is the European Commission banning a product, so using product ban as a policy tool, using the principle of choice editing, not just labeling to consumers, but choice editing. There shall not be some products that are sold on the market because they're not good for the planet, they're not good for our health.
So it just needs to be translated to the British media, which I think were particularly bad at Toastergate and Vacuumgate, and were saying that these were stupid rules by Brussels, if I remember correctly.
Indeed, and I think what's also interesting, thinking about the audience or the agents of change, which are the public, is according to what I heard from DG Environment, the response from the public is overwhelmingly positive, because they see the problem of plastic waste and they say, oh, finally, something concrete that is on that I can see and I can understand and puts us in the right direction. So that's why I thought, let's do music, let's make sure that we hear more, because that's still a long way to go towards resolving plastic waste.
Thank you, Celine. Yes, Patrick, where is the music for you?
Okay, I'll continue the analogy. I think if you see who were the first musicians on the planet, and I think it's clear that the first musicians were creatures, wasn't us. So I think nature's orchestra is perhaps the most fundamental one that we should actually applaud. And I remember hearing a speech a while ago of an American musician who actually created soundscapes. I can't remember his name, I'm sure there's someone in the audience who can say so. But it was amazing, he looked at the soundscapes and then over time sort of compared them. And so you could see that there's beautiful sort of different levels. You had insects, you had birds, you had other animals, and then suddenly after logging, you had silence. And after the dry spell, you had silence. So for my thing, I think the key thing of the orchestra is basically recognizing the beauty of the orchestra of nature. And this brings me to a success, and it's a bit of a complex story because success is never that simple. But first of all, Europe's Natura 2000 network with its 28,000 sites is the world's largest. It's been growing as well also in the marine area. The success I want to highlight is the fact that our Birds and Habitats Directive were under threat via the refit process as part of the better regulation efforts. And there's an analysis across Europe to say, well, what are the values of nature, intrinsic and anthropocentric? And what are the values of this policy as a fit for purpose? There's a huge amount, I imagine probably 3/4 of the people in the room actually replied to that. And then the refit came up with certain conclusions, but in parallel to this refit, there was also a civil society nature alert, which brought up around 630,000 voices. So we did have the voices of the citizens combined with analysis, which came to the conclusion that the Birds and Habitats Directives are fit for purpose, they just haven't been implemented well. So I think that is a success, even though the flip side of that success is there's a lot to do, but I'll leave that for the next round. So just remember the first musicians were the insects.
Beautiful, Patrick, for that analogy and for saying, yes, there have been successes. Patrick, I'm going to ask you to keep on holding the mic and just therefore, very briefly, give me a failure.
Okay, there's a long list here. No,
One.
I think I'd like to underline one, and that's issues of chemicals and hazardous materials. And I think there's two aspects of that. One is on the lack of policy making. We had a promise of a non-toxic environmental strategy in the 7th EAP. It hasn't happened. We have to wait. Hopefully it will come. But much more concrete than that is that there was a report recently done by the German government and organizations looking at the level of compliance of products in the EU market. And here's a fact. They said that a third, or 32% to be accurate, of 1,814 high production volume chemicals made or imported into Europe since 2010 break EU laws. Okay? So it's explicitly recognized that 1/3 of the products on our markets break the laws, and only 1/3 were actually compliant, and the other ones need further research. Now this may look like statistics, but it's actually much bigger than statistics. It's also phthalates in plastic, so those cause problems, endocrine disrupting substances, they cause problems to your hormonal systems. You have lead in jewelry, you have chromium dioxide in cheap leather products. These cause all sorts of problems when you buy them, and for your children's feet, for example. So I think what we have is a lack of confidence that the rule of law applies. The reason for this lack of progress on chemicals is basically multiple. I mean, there's one aspect which is after the crash in 2008, there's been a lot of money sucked away from inspectors, for example. There's not enough resources to go around to inspect, so we can't have a sense of a confidence in the rule of law. Similarly, there is insufficient focus of capacity building around the judges. The judges don't always know how to judge on some of these issues, and there needs to be more investment. In China, they've got, I think, 100 already environmental courts created. In Europe, we've got no environmental courts. We differentiate expertise in terms of inspectors. You have environmental inspectors, but the prosecutors and the judges do not have this sort of capacity. So there's a major systemic failure around chemicals issue, and it's also about political will in actually implementing it. What we basically, to give the positive light at the end, I'll stop with that sentence, we need to be able to have a policy that allows us to have confidence in the products we buy, that the CE label actually means something, that imports are safe, and that we can all have confidence in the rule of law, and links to the confidence in the rule of law, links to the confidence in our institutions, which then bring it back to the presidency roles and the parliamentary roles and the commission roles. We need to trust that Europe can actually deliver on what's important to us.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and I saw that Benedek was nodding his head when you were talking about the lack of compliance on chemical legislation. Benedek, I don't know whether you want to pick up on Patrick's point, but also could you yourself give us one of the things that you're concerned and disappointed about in EU policy.
Yeah, I completely agree with Patrick, and that's my point. And instead of naming one specific policy area, I would like to highlight or underline a governance area, and that's the implementation of environmental law. And I think that that's really the problem, because we might have the best possible legislation and rules in the EU, while we are seeing not only in the chemical area, but also if we come back, and Patrick, you mentioned the nature directives refit process as a success to stop it, but still it's a failure as well, because we were able to stop the review of the nature directives, but we're still not in a better situation in the implementation of the nature directives, and there are serious shortcomings of the implementation and law enforcement in the EU regarding biodiversity regulation, nature directives, chemicals, even climate change regulation. And this is partly due to the missing funding for the institutions. I think that it's a major problem. But sometimes we see that there is a lack of political will in the member states, and the member states and member state governments are really, let's say, that not doing their best to implement in a proper way European environmental rules. And I think that this is a stronger and stronger problem. And perhaps there are differences between the member states, and in some member states the implementation of the environmental legislation is better, but in some member states it really, and I would mention the example of my own home country, Hungary, and perhaps the other member states joining to the EU after 2004, that it was a very quick procedure to transpose European legislation. We have them mostly, not all of them, but mostly we have them on paper. But when it comes to reality, we see that sometimes nothing has been changed, or even sometimes the situation has been worsened because there is higher pressure from the single market on nature, for example, on biodiversity or natural habitats. So I think that it's really important to improve implementation, and the Commission has started some exercises, not strong enough. We have the environmental implementation review exercise and some additional checks and controls over the implementation of the EU law, but it's far from being enough, and still we see the lack of the proper implementation.
So Veronica, I think it's only fair to go to you about the lack of implementation, the implementation deficit, if you'd like to pick up on that point from Benedek first of all.
I tend to agree. I've joined the DG Environment since less than a year now, and for me this is indeed the very cross-cutting deficit that I see, because it seems to me it's an area covered by very robust legislation. There is always scope for modernizing the laws, fine-tuning, but essentially implementation is the key point. But it's a point where I tend not to see only at the dialogue between the European Commission and the Member States, and not only also at the responsibility of the Member States, which certainly are key for enforcement. I always am surprised not to see an even more dynamic contribution by market actors themselves and civic society representatives. Coming maybe, I'm certainly influenced by the fact that I was the former head of the Consumer and Law Department, where you see consumer organization, fighting the old fight, bringing evidence to regulatory authorities when there are problems of dysfunctioning on the market. I would like to see a similarly vivid, dynamic action on the ground, possibly helped by the digital technologies, because this is the other thing that I find a little bit untapped in the environmental area so far. We have satellite data, and yet we seem to be doing a lot of paperwork, not maybe using to the maximum the benefits we could draw from good and innovative technologies to do better monitoring, better reporting, also for enforcement purposes. And we should have several actors of enforcement assisting the member states, maybe also better designed rules for each of the national environmental regulators, and possibly an even better functioning network of European regulators. So I think this is an area where there is scope for further reforms, but we have to be united in doing that. And again, I don't believe in just confrontational kind of attitudes. I think it's something that is there to increase the pressure and put also market actors in motion so that we all march towards the same goal. This is at least what I really believe. Thank you.
Günter, does this concern you also, that there may be good regulations, but it's the implementation, it's the enforcement that's lacking?
Yes, that's true, but I want to mention one other point. Okay, that's all. That's already said about that, but I think what we failed in Europe during the last years was to green the financial flows. You may remember there had been the goal and the target for the last MFF, for the last multi-annual financial framework, that 20% of the overall EU budget should be spent for climate-related actions. And I think we all, it's not only the Commission, it's the Member States and all the financial institutions, we failed to green really the financial flows. There had been done quite a lot of efforts, but I think we had to do it quite faster. And now we are discussing also the new MFF, and there's also again a debate about 20% and 25% should be for climate-related actions within the next MFF. I think it's not only about the percentage, it's really about how we can measure that it is really greening the actions in the next years. And I think that's one point we should really work on it, because money always influences all the actions, and therefore this might be one we have to strengthen. And if we want to have a failure, then it was a failure. We didn't reach really this goal during the last years.
Thank you. Coming to you last, Celine. So we've heard some of the failures, the implementation deficit, not enough of greening on the EU budget, the MFF. Would you agree with those comments, and would you also have another failure?
Yeah, I very much agree, and I think in terms of another failure, first a test. Who knows the Eco Management and Audit Scheme, EMAS? Okay, you're probably not, half of the people. We have 26 million companies, active businesses in the EU. How many have registered for EMAS, which is a voluntary certification scheme? 4,000. You name it, a clear failure. In my view, obviously, we need to ratchet up regulation, but we also need to incentivize and help companies that want to go beyond compliance and help them compete on the basis of best practices in the environmental field. And so I think EMAS, there were clear issues around the design. For instance, there are very few member states that actually provided incentives. Austria is actually doing quite a good on that, because they're giving incentives to companies going through the pain of doing EMAS in terms of public procurement. But many member states actually never took up the scheme. You might say, okay, there might be other schemes that are very good, and it's true that you have ISO 1401, but if you look at ISO, it's actually not having a credible third-party verification. If you look at the UN climate negotiations, lots of companies are making lots of pledges, that is all wonderful, don't we love it? But where is the data in terms of what actually is changing in those companies? So I feel the EU really failed to provide information to the public, to investors, to clients like the state in terms of public procurement on those companies who are doing the best. Instead, it spent a lot of time helping companies who are on the losing side of history. It spent a lot of time on better regulation, but not in the sort of better regulation that helps the trailblazers, that puts the best available science and practices into regulation, but in constantly saying, oh, regulation, red tape, let's do less of that, and let's go more to voluntary schemes. Well, if the voluntary schemes are EMAS, we know we are in a trouble zone. So I really think that I agree with the Austrian presidency, we need to reform EMAS and have something that has much more teeth and is also fully aligned to SDGs, not just the environment.
Thank you very much, Celine. And as you have the microphone that's working, let me then ask you, I mean, is it that the failures have to become a priority, or let's try and drill down on what we would like as some of the priorities in EU policy from 2020 to 2030?
Yes, so in terms of priorities, I just wanted to highlight that many of my comments are made based out of Think 2030. It's a new platform bringing civil society, think tanks, business and local authorities, and we're very grateful that EEB has been a very active partner in this. And we had our conference 2 weeks ago, and what came out clearly is that we need one European strategy post-2020, which is aligned to SDGs, has a horizon in terms of the science to 2050, but has quantified targets to 2030. And within that, one thing that came out very clearly, and actually was not on the list shown previously, is a comprehensive plan for sustainable consumption. I mean, material footprint per capita is so way out of scale in terms of Europe, compared where it needs to be. That ought to be a priority of the next Commission and the next Parliament.
Thank you very much, Celine. Veronica, a priority for the next Commission, this plan on sustainable consumption?
For me, we need something that is truly cross-cutting and encompassing, something like towards a pollution-free and climate-resilient society, which puts together all the various strands of action. Sustainable consumption is one of those. Actually, we're speaking all the time about sustainable food system as such, knowing that we have I don't know, many millions of tons of food being wasted every year, so this is a dramatic problem, but it's only part of the picture. At the same time, we have to continue doing actually the same thing that we put forward in the 7th Environment Action Plan. This is something we should engage with the audience with. Personally, I believe that many of the objectives that were laid down in that action plan stay valid. The reality is that the discussion is really on the how. Because if you don't design all the accompanying measures that allow the member states, with the help of all, I mean, the co-legislators, the citizens, the businesses, to adjust and transform these very, very ambitious targets into something realistic, we are going always to lose, because certain parties will be scared off and just, refuse engaging. If we offer voluntary instruments, I mean, the uptake will be limited. So it's about bringing everyone on board and designing accompanying measures. In doing so, again, I repeat, I think that we have a large untapped potential also of digital technologies, of training courses, of guidance document, and actually the European Parliament will have to help us much, much more together with the Council, because I think we are moving from a stage where we are rather mature in European Union in terms of legislation, and the battle is not just in environmental law, but really in a lot of sectors of EU law about implementation. So how can we mobilize with the assistance of the, I'm almost going to say, former co-legislators, the co-implementation on the ground. This is for me what is laying ahead of us. Thank you.
Just to follow up on implementation then, I mean, do you think that there should be stronger enforcement? Should there be infringement procedures?
But the infringement procedures are, when the Commission realizes that there is a systemic failure of doing something in the member states, it's repeated, it's structural, and then it takes its stick and acts against the member state. For me, this is really the cherry on the cake. Plenty of other things must have happened before, and the problem happened often at a very local level, and it's there that it's up to the citizens, I would say immediately, / those who represent the citizen, to denounce and to make sure that in front of them there are authority with appropriate capacity to take sanctions, administrative measures, whatever is needed. And at the same time, we should always put ourselves in the foot of, let's call it, the polluter. After all, the treaty tells us that we have to, the principle of the polluter pays. We have to understand what's behind the polluter activities. I mean, some cases clearly are blatant breach of existing laws, and it's just in the name of the money that we continue polluting. But I'm not so sure that this is, for example, the case of all the farmers of Europe. I mean, I continue to believe that for some smaller case kind of infringements, there is also an issue of lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, lack of sufficient incentives to change behaviors. What's behind the behavior of you and me when we still take the car in the morning, knowing that we will pollute a bit more than by taking the metro and the public tram? I mean, we are polluting, we know it. Why don't we change? And for me, it's about adding many, many more things around us that really push us and facilitate our choice to go into a different behavior. It's possible, but it takes everyone's involvement.
Benedek, perhaps you'd like to pick up on what you think should be a priority for the next Commission, the next Parliament.
I think that it's almost impossible to say one priority, and when you have a dozen of lethal diseases, you cannot pick up which one you would like to be cured. You want all of them to be cured. So instead of just naming one example, let me to offer a kind of complex cure. And for this, I would use the planetary boundaries approach. If you have a look on those studies, you will find that there are three key areas where we are far beyond our limits. One is clearly climate change, the second is biodiversity loss, and the third is the big biogeochemical cycles, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. And I think that these are the three areas where we have to find some kind of solution to really just offer the survival of humanity. And for this, I think on the EU level, we need a better governance, environmental governance, which consists of different elements. Implementation, better implementation, and law enforcement is one of them. It's already mentioned. I would like to emphasize also the importance of policy coherence. And when you have a look on European law or even European payments or funding, you will see that sometimes we spend a lot of money to solve problems which we created with an enormous amount of money coming from the EU. And this must be stopped, so environmentally harmful subsidies should be stopped, and we need a much better policy coherence. When we are talking about sustainability, this cannot be simply environmental legislation. This must be in agriculture, in industrial policy, in rural development, in everywhere. The third issue is related to that is money, how much money, and not how much money, but it's one question that how much money we spend on sustainability projects, but also that how effectively this money is spent, and sometimes we have difficulties with that. That also, or even the money which we count as money spent on climate or sustainability projects, they are sometimes hardly more than some cosmetic practices, in fact. And the last point, I think that it's really closely and highly related to the idea of good governance, is transparency and participation. And I truly believe that we cannot find a solution with a top-down decision-making system we are mostly having not only in the EU but in the member states. And we have to open the decision-making process. We have to open our institutions to the citizens and to involve the European society, NGOs and individual citizens to decision-making much more than they are already involved, partly because they have good ideas. That's a huge resource for our actions, and also because I think that that's the best guarantee of the proper control and check over the bad decisions.
Benedek, thank you. And well, Günter, there's a lot to play with there. There's good governance, transparency, greater policy coherence as priorities. Would you agree with Benedek, or do you have something to add to that list?
First of all, I want to say that I agree with all these ideas which have to be, but I especially want to echo one point which Mr. Benedek Jávor mentioned, and this is environmental harmful subsidies. I think that there should be one really clear target. No EU money in the future should be spent for environmental harmful projects in Europe, because this is really a field of governance. If EU money is spent to destroy the environment, this is the wrong signal. I know that it's not done by the Commission. I know that it's not done by the European Parliament. It's done by the member states. But then we see always these plates in front of the project. We have used 40% or 50% of the money coming from the EU. And if citizens can see that with EU money you can destroy the environment, then this is the wrong signal. And I think that we should really work on it. So there should be a clear target, no EU money for environmental harmful projects in Europe for the next 5 or 6 years of the MFF.
Veronica, would you agree with that? Totally. Stressing that I don't know exactly what is in the mind of the previous speakers, but if we think of Dieselgate, just to mention one, we should all be aware of the fact that, I mean, per se the legislation was technology neutral, and it's true that there have been attitudes at different levels, business one, national one, etc. So I would say yes, we are all co-responsible. But it's also interesting to see how, once again, even that one is clearly a problem of implementation of a law that per se was fixing certain objectives, certain targets, was technology neutral, was clearly saying you have to still respect all the equality objectives. So it raises a lot of interesting questions, I would say. Let me add one point, because I'm fresh from my trip to Geneva this week. I was last week at the first global summit organized by the World Health Organization on the links between air pollution and health. I think that global conference really showed how important it is that we remain cross-cutting and putting also health very much at the center of our preoccupation. If we choose encompassing goals to be reached and create the appropriate accompanying measures, we can cover all the various strands of action at which we are going to look, about which we care. Chemical pollution, food systems, air quality, water quality. So my plea is really to try and stay focused on the cross-cutting challenges in order to unite also all the national administrations behind, all the civic society forces behind. This is really, for me, the name of the challenge.
Understood, yes, everything is coordinated. You were mentioning Geneva, which makes me think that, of course, the EU is looking for its brighter green vision, sustainable development. We do have the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which the EU is committed to. I'm just wondering, if I go to you, Patrick, about these SDGs. What could be done more at a European level to make sure that it's aligned with the global level?
Can I first have my vision as to what's needed for the next step?
Why not?
Okay, right. So yes, I mean, I agree with all the points above here. Now, you mentioned Geneva. I'll start with Vienna. Last year we had together with our colleagues, members of the Dachverband, had a policy forum there, looking at the experience of the 7th EAP. And developing some thoughts for an 8th EAP. And I think that there's one thing that we need to do is to basically commit to an 8th EAP which could catalyse the transition to a one planet economy.
Okay, so we'll do the European Environmental Action Programme.
First, yeah.
But right, let's do that first before we go bigger than into the SDGs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And I think, I mean, a lot of what should be inside of a lot of the elements have already been picked up, and it's been, to keep with the analogy, having subsidy reform is music to my ears. But I think there's one thing that's, the one thing that I think is new, and this is in Vienna it was picked upon, the issue of lock-ins and systemic problems. And also was at the European Environment Advisory Council Annual Conference 2 weeks ago, and again they focused a lot on the lock-ins. And I think that's something new that we could have in an 8th EAP, is focusing on the sort of systemic lock-ins that we face. Because just doing what we've committed is one part of the solution. But I think there's a range of lock-ins where the materials, if you think of fossil fuels, harmful chemicals or plastics, we can substitute away each of these. There's infrastructure lock-ins which we have with roads, airplanes, pipelines, airports, pipelines, building stock. I mean, again, these are lock-ins. They lock us in for a long period of time. So we should also look very carefully where European money is spent or national money is spent on these type of infrastructure. We've already mentioned systems. We mentioned the agri-food systems. We're locked into a certain type of farming approach. We need to look at it carefully and develop a strategy. How do we actually transition beyond the lock-in? What levers can we use? We've heard about economic paradigms and incentives. We heard the subsidies, but our whole model is focused on growth. If you look at the pricing system in our economies, they actually give us incentives to destroy things rather than to save things. So we need a systemic look at how the pricing issues and the models behind both are there. And then of course there's the habits, norms and attitudes which we need to look at. All of us have our own habitudes. I think you mentioned the cycling, public transport rather than private transport, but getting people to change is really, really difficult. So we also need to move away from consumers as consumers towards citizens, towards sufficiency, and also to get rid of our growth fixation. We should fix our ideas on well-being rather than that. So if these things can be had as strategies, and in the 6th Environmental Action Plan, you actually had a useful tool, which is the strategies. If we can then look and use a bit of thinking around how we can actually make the transition, get lever out of the lock-ins, and I think we've made a huge step forward. And that I think is parallel to the SDGs.
Okay, so let's break this down. You were talking about the lock-ins, and you would like these reflected in an eventual European Environmental Action Programme, an 8th. Celine, is lock-ins where you would put your priorities for the next EAP, if there is one, or would you have other priorities?
I'll probably talk about something else, and I think that's building on what Veronica said in terms of well-being. Putting well-being again at the center. And I think we're starting to do that in terms of thinking of air pollution, food, but where we're still missing a link is the link with social justice. We need to think about the interface between environmental degradation, environmental policy, and leaving no one behind, the just transition. But even going further and looking at the correlation between multidimensional inequality, income, minorities, gender, generational issues, geography, to really think, okay, where are there win-wins? Where are there difficult dilemmas? Can we build an agenda? Because if you look at the last Eurostat report on SDGs, it's actually, thank you, thanks for showing that. That comes from, I think, 2030. It really shows that where Europe is going in the wrong direction is inequalities. And I come from, the social justice background and went into the environment. And I think we ought to look at what sort of taxation policy in Europe would help us actually address inequalities while at the same time protecting the planet. And for that, we need to start breaking silos and really to think very holistically or systemically, which is Patrick's favorite approach, so that we also don't bring to citizens that the environmental agenda is an agenda for the wealthy who are already lucky enough to have their basic needs covered. I mean, that really needs to change.
Benedek, a focus on well-being and your thoughts on if there should be an eventual 8th EAP. What would be a priority for you?
Well, first I would like to say that, and perhaps this example helps us to better understand that how European policy making can go wrong. And the illustration is energy policy. And we are in the middle of a huge energy policy transition. In Europe, we adopted most of the elements of the Clean Energy for All package, and we might say that we have quite a good outcome at the very end. Still, and I would come back to both of the issues you mentioned, the lock-ins and social justice, or environmental justice, let's say this. Because in the new energy policy area, or framework, still we see that in the name of the security of supply and to reduce dependency and also to help member states to leave coal and perhaps parts of oil. Sometimes we invest in infrastructure which creates finally a huge lock-in, especially when we talk about, for example, gas pipelines. And if you have a look on the PCI list, which is, you asked me not to mention too much acronyms from this EU language. So the projects of community interest, which are in the interest of the whole EU, 95% of them are about gas pipelines and some electricity grid developments, which can create a situation with the best intention that we create LNG terminals, we build gas pipelines, which lock in Europe into a fossil-based energy system, into a gas-based energy system, instead of using this opportunity which we are having right here and now in Europe to make a quick transition to energy efficiency and renewable-based energy system. And once we build this infrastructure, we will have to use it. And everybody will say that, okay, we spend a lot of money to that, so we shouldn't just throw it away. And this could mean that instead of really speeding up the transition to a sustainable, renewable, and energy efficiency-based energy system, we will stock into basically gas-based energy system. And the same with social justice. Because Europe is spending money, for example, to subsidize renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects. One example from my home country, it was in 2014, there was, they opened European sources for citizens to use it to renewable energy projects. There was a 30% contribution rate from EU funds. And what happened? 80% of the money was spent in one district of the capital city of Hungary, Budapest, which is the richest district of the city. Because we used the EU funds in the wrong way, and finally, instead of using energy efficiency, which has a huge potential to elevate energy poverty and to help those households and vulnerable groups who are really suffering from energy poverty, we use EU funds and regulation even to widen the gap in the society. And I think that here, this is the perfect illustration how energy markets or energy policy in the EU works, that sometimes with the best intention to move towards it, but I also could mention the biofuels example, where with the best intentions we made wrong decisions, we made to the wrong direction, and finally our policies, our rules, our laws, and our money was not used for going to a sustainable and just future, but right to the opposite. And I think that that's the important, to have this comprehensive and complex approach, and to use the sustainability transition of Europe in a way which is really effective, which is inclusive. You cannot save just parts of Europe, or being it parts of the member states or parts of the society. We find a solution for a sustainable Europe as such, or we are not finding a solution.
And would you like to see those sort of concerns reflected in an eventual 8th European Environmental Action Programme? Would you like to see that focus on social justice and addressing these lock-in concerns?
But this is to say that the 8th Environmental Action Programme is just a small part of the story. It has very few to do with energy policy decisions, or almost nothing to do with social justice. So I think that what is important, yes, the 8th EAP is important, and we have to turn it into an action program which is comprehensive, complex, and helps the sustainability transition in Europe. But we cannot expect from the ACE Environmental Action Program to solve our problems, because sometimes the problems are outside the framing of environmental policy making. This is in energy policy making, this is in agriculture, subsidies and policy making, this is in transport, and I know that there are parts of the ACAP regarding transport and agriculture as well, but most of the things which should be changed are not covered or are too big to be changed by the ACE Environmental Action Program. So it's important, it's an important part of the solution, but we cannot wait for the ACE Environmental Action Program to give a solution or give an answer to our problems.
Thank you very much, Benedek. Yes, Günter, I know that you have been very active in the 7th Environmental Action Programme. I mean, the 8th, I take Benedek's point that it's just point of it, but is this something that you think should happen, that there should be an 8th programme, and what would you like to see the priorities in it?
Thanks. Before I answer this, I just want to have one example added to the lock-in effects, especially in the field of energy, and this is nuclear power, because you may know that Austria banned using nuclear energy, and therefore it should be added to gas, especially. Coming back to the 8th Environmental Programme, we had just last week in Austria, in Graz, the informal meeting of the environmental ministers. And we put on the agenda the discussion about an 8th Environmental Action Program. Why? There is a 7th, but there is no evidence that there must be an 8th one. It's up to the composer, it's up to the Commission to come up with a first draft. And that's why, as the presidency put it on the agenda, and the result of this informal environmental council last week in Austria was that all member states present in the room put a clear message on the table of the Commission, that they should prepare an 8th Environmental Action Program as one of the first priorities of the new Commission, because if there is no clear voice from the member states, then there will be less interest maybe of the Commission to come up with that. So what we intended is to have a clear voice. It happened. All 28 member states of the European Union, all the environmental ministers said, we need it, we want it, and the Commission should come up. Of course, then in close cooperation with negotiation with the Parliament, but there must be a first draft, and the member states are ready to be involved, are ready to bring in the ideas for an 8th environmental program. There will be various ideas, of course, but the message was clear. We need it, we want it, and we want to discuss it as early as we can.
Understood. So Veronica, that's on your desk as the Commission. This will be one of your to-do lists.
Well, not strictly mine, but almost. I will certainly have to be very involved, but indeed it's an extremely recent message that has come from all the member states. We welcome it, although at the same time, I think we were also between the hammer of the chopper of the discussion that you're reading right now. Because if an honorable number of members of the Parliament who has been following the implementation of the 7th H Action Programme believes that the 8th will never have the teeth to reach the objective also of social justice, of a truly cross-cutting approach, somehow this is not very comforting to hear, because I think that what the Commission is trying to cherish is a really cross-cutting approach, bringing Europe as such on a path towards a more sustainable development. So, but we heard what came out from the Ministries of Environment, and as usual, you can count on the European Commission to continue working for speed, because we are already working. We are already working on a narrative, on a way to present the priorities in a manner that they are truly encompassing and cross-cutting, that they can hopefully be very appealing for the next Commission, for the next European Parliament, for the next member states, and responding to the needs that we see coming from the citizens. So this is taking place and shape, and we welcome opportunities like this also to listen.
Veronica, thank you very much. I also wanted, therefore, to go on this broader level now, just before we go to the audience, of the Sustainable Development Goals. The European Union is committed to Sustainable Development Goals, but how do you show that this is actually in reality, that there is something positive that comes out of this and that you're aligned with those Sustainable Development Goals, and that we have something positive, as Celine was saying, at least with the plastics directive, you've got something positive that citizens can understand have come out of one of these policy frameworks?
As we speak, we are negotiating again with the colleagues of the Presidency and the European Parliament a revision of the Drinking Water Directive, which is precisely responding to the Clean Water and Sanitation Goal number 6, just to mention one, not to mention objectives of increased public health. The Commission has been tabling a very big number of strategies. I would say that the entire circular economy perfectly matches into the Sustainable Development Goals as such. If you read the goals, actually the European Union is working on all of them on a daily basis. The point is, are we working towards them with the sufficient level of ambition? How do we measure that? Are we really taking everyone on board? And this is where I think there is scope for discussion. But mention me one of the Sustainable Development Goals where you see that the European Union is not acting. I'm curious to ask you the question instead.
Well, I would want to know about SDG 5 and women, but...
Gender equality, wow! I mean, gender equality, this is the Commission that has been working on the fight against female genital mutilation. I think we have been going public everywhere with awareness-raising campaign. It goes beyond the scope of activities of DG Environment, of course, but still, it's the Commission which has been tabling a very ambitious strategy, subscribing to the, I hope I don't get it wrong, Istanbul Convention on the fight on violence on women, putting in place a lot of measures across member states. So, I mean, a lot is happening, a huge amount of things are happening, also to the point where I don't know to what extent what the Commission does is truly repercuted and percolated to the ground, which is the eternal challenge of the European Commission. We are very few, trying to do our best to outreach, but unless we have very vibrant civic society, media, assisting us in delivering the messages, we will always be a little bit lagging behind, you see, and not able to communicate to the best. But honestly, I think that this Commission has been doing quite a lot on gender equality.
We've gone from gender equality into environment. Let me just ask Celine about the commitment of the Commission to the SDGs. Do you see that it is as Veronica says, or would you like more to be done?
Well, I think for me, I mean, we are just ahead of the European elections. I mean, most citizens have never heard of SDGs. And I think there is a work to be done by policymakers to really translate the SDGs in something simple that people can see in their daily lives. So in Think 2030, we proposed a very simple framework around well-being at the center, supported by prosperity, peace and security, and protection of nature. And if you actually look at polls of European citizens, you would see that their concerns totally match those elements. I would also explain to citizens that SDGs should be at the center of Europe's diplomacy. I mean, we are in a world where many players are, although they signed up to that agenda, have absolutely no intention of implementing it and actually threatening the global implementation. I mean, if Bolsonaro destroys the Amazon, well, you know, there are quite a few goals out there that just get obliterated right away. The second thing I wanted to say is the Parliament needs to do its homework, because it is still a debate in terms of the SDGs that's stuck in the Envy committee and obviously the Dev committee, but other committees do not see SDGs as part of the agenda. I think we need a European SDG summit during the Finnish presidency, very similar to the Paris-Lima agenda that re-injected strength into the climate negotiations. And maybe to finish, I'm really struck by how Eurostat is reporting on SDGs. Today, you know, civil society space is under threat in Europe, in many countries. whether it's by regulation, by lack of funding, or by outright attacks on particular individuals, when it's not murdering journalists. You know, we're not even monitoring that because we feel we're doing so well on peace, justice and security. So I think also Europe needs to take a hard look at itself and where it's come in terms of democracy, and make sure it's monitoring the things that will actually allow for civil society to push for better outcomes in the end. Because you can't ask civil society to do all the heavy lifting and not give them the very basic environment they need to be able to do that.
Thank you, Celine, and I think that's actually something that's going to come across in our panel this afternoon when we will talk about that. Patrick, I wouldn't want to not give you the floor before going to the audience. Do you have something to say on the SDGs?
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I think the audience needs to speak. The SDGs reminds me of when Sweden joined the European Union. You might not, because Sweden actually thought we've got a really wonderful set of laws in place. We actually don't need to look at the European legislation. I'm oversimplifying, and apologies to any Swedes. And they thought therefore automatically they would comply with everything. Then as the years went on, they sort of looked at the legislation again, said actually there's some missed opportunities here, and then they did some new things. And I think the same goes with the SDGs. I think the European Commission helped negotiate a good global SDG agreement and should be thanked for that. But then thinking back, saying, well, actually, we're doing most of it anyway with the other policies. So it hasn't taken the time to really look to there's a cross-link or to communicate, as we've just heard now, a lot of the steps which are being taken. So I think that's the sort of the first bit. I think there is, and so it will be interesting to see what comes out of the reflection paper on the in December, early December, I think. Hopefully that's ambitious. I think there is still an opportunity of integrating the SDGs in the multi-annual financial framework, i.e. the EU budget, because it's not really present there. And then of course it's integration and communication. But I think it's a wonderful commitment, the SDGs, and it really should be systemically integrated throughout. Of course it doesn't go far enough in the end, there's always more to do, but I think it's a good, huge first step.
Well, thank you, this panel, for talking about what you see as the successes, the failures, looking at the implementation deficit. We've touched on whether there will be an 8th EAP, and of course we've gone broader on SDGs. So lots of food for thought there, and I'd like to go to our audience. And you have two options. If you do actually get onto Wi-Fi, and I'm looking at my technical support here, that if you are on Wi-Fi, please try Slido again. It says, no, there we are, on slido.com, and you can ask a question. You can ask a question. And I have Ariadna from Greenpeace. And she says, if GDP growth is the driver for environmental destruction, why changing the economic model is not even considered by the main parties? How to change that? I would imagine, Ariadna, I don't know whether you've got somebody, and thank you, that you would particularly like to answer that question? Benedek, perhaps?
For example, or anybody else?